October 3, 1999, Marion, Ohio. Stepmother Mary Ellen Duvall vanished after Sunday service. Her stepson claimed she ran off with a lover. No body was found, just her purse in the driveway. 25 years later, a dusty fingerprint, AFIS, and a forgotten bank account unravel a lie rooted in resentment. October 3, 1999, started like 100 other Sundays in Marion, Ohio. Cool air drifted across the cornfields and slid through the wooden slats of little white houses. The church bells at First Baptist rang out across Harvest Road around 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes before service started. Mary Ellen Duvall was already seated in her usual third-row pew, wearing a lavender skirt suit and her signature silk scarf, the same one she'd worn to Calvin's funeral 2 years earlier. She'd baked a cinnamon coffee cake that morning, half gone when she left. Her house still smelled of ground cinnamon and reheated Folgers when police would walk into it hours later. But that scent, and what came next, remains burned into the memory of this town like the faded "God is love" sign that still hangs above the church podium. After the service, many saw her chatting with Deacon White beside the coat rack. She hugged little Sally Wheeler, complimented Doris Hughes's crocheted gloves, and stepped out into the parking lot around 12:07 p.m. She never made it to lunch with her friend Barb, and she didn't answer calls that evening. At precisely 7:39 p.m., a man's voice, flat, low, came through the non-emergency line at Marion County PD. "This is Keith Duvall. I think my stepmother's missing. Mary Ellen, she didn't come home from church today. Her car's here, but not her. Front door's wide open." Detective Wallace Crawley was called from his home dinner table, meatloaf growing cold on China maps of America plates. Mary Ellen Duvall rang a faint bell. Small-town cops know names, even if they don't always know the lives behind them. Within the hour Wallace arrived, the sky already taking on that strangely orange autumn glow, half guilt, half nostalgia, just before full darkness sets in. The Duvall home on Harvest Road looked frozen in time. Vinyl siding, lilac bushes, hand-tied wind chimes lifting faintly in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of hairspray, warm coffee, and the faint memory of Sunday pot roast. Calvin had remodeled the kitchen himself in 91 green tile counters and a double stainless sink. There was dinner for one in the fridge. The plastic wrap still clung tightly over a plate of honey-glazed carrots and thin-sliced ham. Her Buick, a pale blue 91 LeSabre, sat crooked in the gravel at a slight angle. The driver's side door was ajar. Her purse rested at the base of the driver's seat, wallet untouched, keys still on the ring. "Not typical runaway behavior," Wallace muttered to his partner, rookie officer Jenna Morales, who scribbled nervously into her pad. The mailbox was crammed with catalogs, Land's End, pennies, an expired offer from Sears. The calendar by the kitchen phone showed a circle around October 6th, no label. Her cordless phone's talk button was blinking faintly. Morales checked the recent calls, 3 hang-ups. Neighbors weren't helpful, at least not yet. Doris said she saw Mary Ellen pulling into her driveway around noon, but wasn't sure if she ever got out of the car. "Might have been someone else. I didn't look too close. Was watering my asters." She didn't see or hear anything unusual afterward. No shouts, no cars speeding off. No one ever did in Marion, except teenagers with mufflers held together by duct tape. Keith, 32, long and wiry, internal at the grain elevator, answered questions with the polite detachment of a man talking about someone he tolerated more than loved. "We weren't close, if that's what you're getting at. She's not my mom, never was, but I don't hate her or anything. We just lived parallel, you know." He had been out most of the afternoon, he claimed, driving to Bucyrus to visit a friend about a used ATV. Couldn't remember the name or number. Fuel station cameras were unreliable, still recording to old VHS tapes, most reused and taped over with scarecrow festivals and family reunions. Inside Mary Ellen's bedroom, the bed was half-made. One pillow had a faint oval where her head still might have rested the night before. Bureau drawers held folded scarves, Avon talc powder tins, and rosary beads that belonged to her mother. On top of her dresser was an old Polaroid taken in '85, the year she married Calvin. She's smiling, holding a McDonald's apple pie, standing in front of the house in late October. Her hair, red then, blazes in the sun. No forced entry, no blood, no signs of a struggle, at least not visibly. And yet, the purse, the keys, the door ajar, the gap between intention and disruption felt real. If she wanted to run away, Wallace said, why leave the purse? Why leave the damn pie warming in the oven? The case didn't burst onto front pages. In small towns, missing adults who leave no signs of distress are often chalked up quietly. She got overwhelmed, had a secret lover, needed space. People talk quietly over gas pumps and in line at the Piggly Wiggly but rarely shout. Within weeks, the official buzz around Mary Ellen Duvall's disappearance had faded. But for Wallace, and for her sister downstate, who kept calling every week, it stuck under the skin like a splinter no one could quite grasp enough to remove. Back at the station, Wallace looked once more at the file. The last timestamp on her answering machine, 12:11 p.m. And then nothing. She vanished just when the faithful were finishing their after-church naps and getting up for Sunday supper. No one heard a thing. But whatever happened, it didn't start with that Sunday. It started much earlier. People in Marion said Calvin Duvall was a quiet giant. Tall, solemn, formerly a mechanic at the old Texaco station before they paved over it in '86. After his first wife died of cancer in '82, he spent 3 years mostly alone, kept to an evening beer on the screened porch, and tended to his tomatoes like they held all the answers. Then, in '85, Mary Ellen Weaver arrived. She worked part-time at the public library and hosted a Thursday night Bible circle. Her laugh was quick, but not forced, and she always wore coats with wide shoulder pads and sturdy heels like the women in Sears catalogs. She moved in before the end of the year. The marriage happened quietly. Pastor Hunt married them in the floral room off Main. Only close family invited, though some noted Keith Duvall didn't attend. He didn't approve, said Doris Hughes, who lived 2 doors down all those years. That woman walked into a life he thought was still his mama's. He liked Mary Ellen about as much as a splinter in a church pew. Still no fights loud enough to be heard, no slamming doors or public squabbles. Mary Ellen waved politely. Keith nodded back. The distance between them wasn't messy, it was finely pressed, like the linens she kept in her cedar chest. They coexisted for a while. Mary Ellen often told her sister June that she couldn't quite get Keith to open a window in that locked-up soul. She tried dinner invitations, offers to co-sign on school loans, even left notes in his lunch cooler back when he worked second shift. He never responded, just took his lunch and kept his wall up. When Calvin passed away in March of 1997, massive heart attack in the garden, Mary Ellen sat folded inside herself all through the funeral. The fields were barren then, temporary snow streaked across them like ash. Keith, now the sole heir due to an outdated will, inherited the house, truck, and Duvall accounts. Mary Ellen was allowed to stay, per verbal agreement, but ownership rested with him. Neighbors noticed gradual changes. Mary Ellen stopped sitting on the porch after dinner. Her lilac bushes got trimmed too low, jagged like bad haircuts. Keith brought home beers more often, nothing rowdy, just a six-pack on the tailgate while listening to sports radio alone. The porch light stayed off even before sunset. From the outside, nothing dramatic, no yelling, no police calls. But Mary Ellen's friend Barb recounted a lunch from early '99 at Lou's Cafe off Route 4. She kept steering the talk away from home. When I asked how Keith was doing, she changed the subject so fast you'd think I'd cursed, but her eyes gave it away. That dragged-down look, like she was waiting on a train that wasn't coming. The kitchen remained hers, though Keith often ate out. She posted recipes on the fridge in bright Sharpie, meatloaf variations, crockpot spaghetti with a splash of A1 was her hallmark. The house never smelled rotten or neglected. It wasn't that kind of unhappy. For his part, Keith maintained appearances, still worked the grain elevators, still wore sturdy boots and tucked-in shirts like his father had. He paid the bills, kept the tools sharpened, and made sure the hedges didn't overgrow too far, but there was no warmth. Mary Ellen once said she felt like a ghost he chose not to see. In her bedroom, the TV still had a working VCR. Tucked beside it, worn-out VHS tapes, Touched by an angel, homeward bound, and a Christmas without snow. A crocheted blanket, pink and navy, rested over the recliner by the window, where she'd read in silence most nights. Her sister said she reread Little Women every fall, like clockwork. That copy still had the bookstore receipt from 1979 tucked inside. The loneliness didn't shout, it cracked at the corners. Wallace Crawley, now digging deeper, remembered something Barb had let slip, that Mary Ellen once hinted about selling the house and taking a fresh start. He hadn't taken note back then because no one knew Mary Ellen had legal no right to sell the house. Keith did. But those passing comments now took on a different tone, darker than regret. Back at the station, Wallace compared the file to old property paperwork. Technically, Mary Ellen had no legal claim to the house since the assets went to Keith, but she stayed, likely because Calvin intended her to. No will change was ever filed. A verbal promise, maybe. A promise that Keith, perhaps, had no intention of keeping. The front window in her sitting room overlooked the rose bushes she planted in '88. That's where she sat every evening at dusk with a mug of Lipton tea, beige saucer, sugar cube. She told friends once, the roses bloom best in October, start to go out bold, not fading. She said that the very week she disappeared. When pressed again, Keith shrugged. His hands remained calm in his lap. He glanced down once, then said, "She wasn't unhappy, just restless lately. Said the town felt small, too small for starting over, that's all she said. Nothing else. But everything, every scrap of decor, every recipe, every preserved detail in that modest house told a different story. It was her home. He knew it. And she was quietly, politely, about to take that away. The first time the word divorce came up, it clattered like a dropped plate. It was Barb again, Mary Ellen's closest friend, who finally confessed. About 6 months before she vanished, Mary Ellen had told her over lunch at Miller's Diner that she was starting to look at options. Barb said she stirred her tomato soup without taking a sip. I asked her what kind of options, and she tilted her head, smiled a little, and said, real soft, the kind that don't involve staying stuck. That's all she said, but I knew what she meant. Mary Ellen had always been proper, never raised her voice in company, always wrote thank you cards, crossed her T's as neatly as she folded cardigans. Divorce seemed like something she would find too scandalous to consider, but pain changes manners, and quiet resentment grows louder the longer you live alongside it. By summer 1999, she'd begun speaking more freely to people she trusted. To her sister June, she said she was done pretending like a houseguest in her own home. To Barb, she admitted Keith had changed. He'd grown more withdrawn after Calvin's passing, came and went at odd hours. There was no blow-up, no outright cruelty, just frost. And then there was the man in Florida. Not a name, not even a real description. Just someone from one of those groups online, Mary Ellen had said, a widower like her, fellow Christian. They'd connected through a message board on AOL, trading scripture quotes and music recommendations. She told Barb it made her feel seen again. He emails at night when he can't sleep, she'd said. Says he likes how I use parentheses in sentences. Isn't that funny? Wallace Crawley had pulled her internet history back then, but it was patchy. Keith had unplugged the modem before police got there. Said the cat had knocked it down. Mary Ellen had used a shared desktop with an early Internet Explorer browser, but AOL message boards and their email systems weren't archived in any helpful way for small-town police in 1999. At the time, Wallace had no cause to press further about it. Lonely woman meets online suitor was exactly the stuff of felonies. But now that suitor, likely fictional, began to seem very convenient, a way to frame an exit without a visible fight. Wallace retrieved the legal folder from the probate office. Inside it was a manila envelope, creased with age, marked in Mary Ellen's handwriting, private, June 1999. It had been discovered in a safe deposit box at Heartland Savings once probate proceedings began in 2023. Inside were preliminary divorce papers. property dispute forms Mary Ellen never technically had the authority to file, given she wasn't on the deed. A statement of intent, dated May 14, 1999, that reads, "After prayer and consideration, I believe it is time for me to seek independence. This is not about bitterness, but about reclaiming peace." It was unsigned. There was also a note addressed to June, folded in half and sealed with a leaf sticker. June never opened it. She gave it to Wallace, hands trembling. The letter was short, written with a purple gel pen. "Dear Junie, if you're reading this, it means I either got brave or something got in the way. I trust you'll understand either way. I can't stay in this house much longer. I don't dislike Keith, but he chills the air, and I won't live ashamed of wanting joy again." It ended with a line that haunted Wallace for days. "There's a truth in me that's tired of being polite." That letter changed everything. The theory that she'd run away, the one everyone tolerated in silence, suddenly looked thin as gauze. Why prep paperwork, write emotional goodbyes, pack bags, and leave your purse? Wallace revisited the maiden name account being flagged by Heartland Savings. He noticed the name on the cosigner line, Keith Calvin Duvall. It had first been opened in 1997, shortly after Calvin's death. Deposits matched the frequency of Mary Ellen's paychecks, small library checks, mostly, but periodically there were larger cash amounts. A few hundred here, 700 in April 1999, another 1,000 that June. Had she been hiding money, preparing for her exit? Wallace asked for the signature cards and withdrawal slips. Handwriting analysis wouldn't say much after so long, but one thing was undeniable. Keith had access to that account. Had she trusted him enough to involve him, or had he forced himself in? Back in the evidence locker, Wallace pulled the old inventory list from 1999. One item stood out that hadn't been flagged as suspicious then, a folder of tax records and mail held together with a rubber band. Why would Mary Ellen leave behind financial papers unless she left in a panic? He kept going back to Keith's police statement. She was probably meeting that Florida guy, said something last week about needing to feel young again. I bet she pulled a fast one. Pulled a fast one, an oddly harsh phrase for someone calmly mourning their vanished stepmother. Keith never filed a missing persons follow-up, never ran a classified, never called Barb or June or her prayer group. He acted like the chapter closed itself. On one corner of Mary Ellen's bedroom desk were 2 boarding pass printouts, both dated for October 5th. Destination, Jacksonville, Florida, printed from an AOL travel affiliate page that hasn't existed in 2 decades. Wallace only recognized it from an old fraud case. No ticket stubs were found, no luggage retrieved. She never made it to that flight. She had a plan, she had cash, she had reason. And all of it fell off the edge of that Sunday. Inside the church office, Wallace requested their parking lot sign-in sheet from October 3rd. Some churchgoers still liked to list their names. It was an old-fashioned tradition. Mary Ellen's name was there. On the line below hers, though, scribbled barely legibly, was Keith's. He had told Wallace he spent the morning at home. Small towns don't forget, but they do get tired. By November of 1999, with no body, no suspect, and no blood, Mary Ellen Duvall's disappearance settled quietly into that gray space most people prefer. The unknown, not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive, just gone. Detective Wallace Crawley hadn't shelved the case out of apathy, just lack of air. The leads had thinned to vapor, and if you stood still too long in a case like this, people started looking at you like you were trying too hard. At the time, the evidence board in the corner of Wallace's office looked like a half-finished puzzle with the wrong box lid. Red string, Polaroids, interview notes, nothing made a clear picture. The home had given few clues. But there was one detail that had never sat right. Behind the house, past the worn concrete slab and rusted garden shears, led a short path to where Calvin used to keep an old workbench. Just dirt now, grown over. There was a single set of boot prints in that dirt. Mismatched, one full print, the heel deep in the soil, like someone had been carrying something heavy, and then nothing. It rained 2 days later. That was the end of the prints. Back in '99, the tech was limited. The boots could have been Keith's or any number of generic work brands. Wallace sent the photos and a cast to the lab in Columbus, but given the standard sole pattern, it was inconclusive. A half-print on the Buick's back passenger door was worse, partial, smudged, unreadable by 1990s standards. They dusted it, photographed it, filed it, but without a print to match, it joined the rest of the someday evidence in the filing cabinet. Keith had claimed he hadn't even touched the car that day, said he noticed it was parked weird but left it alone. "Wasn't my business," he told the first officer. Still, the Buick had always puzzled Wallace. The way it sat stubbornly in the driveway, its driver's side door halfway shut like someone got out quickly or never meant to leave it open. Inside, the gear shift was in park, keys dangling as if frozen mid-motion. Her bag, open on the floorboard, still held a slightly worn lipstick next to her checkbook. There was no sign of a break-in, no shatter, no prime marks, and yet the home's front door was unlocked. The back door, the one Keith used most, was stuck slightly ajar when officers arrived. The presence of small things made her absence louder. An uneaten slice of pie in the microwave, the smell just starting to sour. A bottle of Jean Naté cologne on her vanity. An old shopping list still on the fridge, with instant coffee underlined twice. In her trash bin, Wallace had found an envelope torn sharply down the middle. It had been postmarked from Florida, but the remaining part didn't contain a return address. The inked stamps had since faded to pale pink. Surely a coincidence, or not? Wallace had revisited it often in the first year. He'd file loose-leaf notes to himself in a yellow legal pad. What was in that envelope? Who packed those flight itineraries? Why didn't she bring a suitcase? There had been a suitcase missing, in fact. Mary Ellen always kept a red hardshell Samsonite under the bed. Barb remembered her saying it was the only one I'd trust for Florida. It wasn't in the house, but back then, Wallace couldn't label that as evidence. No blood, no prints, no crime scene. It was a missing suitcase in a missing person case. In isolation, every detail looked like maybe. Altogether, still a maybe. And then, things turned truly cold. By spring of 2000, Wallace filed the case into long-term status. Not closed, just asleep, waiting. Every few months, he'd revisit it, reread the statements, stare at the Buick photo, revisit interviews, but Keith had moved on, quietly kept working, cut his hair shorter, started dating a woman named Michelle who worked part-time at the livestock feed store. Folks said he'd gotten tired eyes since Mary Ellen vanished. "Poor guy," someone would always say at the diner. "Lost 2 parents in 2 years, that'll age a man." And Wallace would sit a table over, drinking his burnt coffee black, saying nothing. He remembered the morning an old deputy, now retired, came into the station and asked. She leave for Florida without her prescriptions, without calling her sister, with soup simmering. Wallace had no answer, only instincts. But instincts can't hold a gavel. In late 2000, the file quietly moved into a secondary cabinet in the archives. A label printer popped out a new tag. Case 21099, DUVALL-ME status, cold file. The red string came down, the map tacks went back into their tin. But Wallace left the Polaroid on his board, that snapshot of Mary Ellen in '85. Still smiling, still holding that crinkled fast food apple pie. Frozen just before a future that never happened. They say money doesn't lie. But in Mary Ellen's case, it waited. It was early April 2023. A junior clerk at Heartland Savings and Loan was cleaning out dormant accounts, printing closure notices, when she flagged one that hadn't seen a single transaction in over 2 decades. The account holder, Mary Ellen Weaver Duvall. Balance 42,311.17, unclaimed, untouched since 1999. Normally this would have gone unnoticed, but the clerk was new, meticulous, and cross-checking for probate flags in light of regional fraud changes. The account had been tied to a safe deposit box recently opened during estate resolution. And something else stood out, a second name on the signature card. Co-signer Keith Calvin Duvall. A call was placed to the Duvall estate attorney, who, puzzled, passed it to the Marion County Probate Office. Eventually, it landed on Detective Wallace Crawley's desk. The words Mary Ellen on any paper still made him pause. The bank tech, while trying to explain it over the phone, spoke in nervous circles. It's not a joint checking account exactly, more like a survivorship amendment on a secondary savings folder. Could have been opened in person. Back in, let's see, 1997, right after her husband passed. Wallace drove to the branch himself. The bank, remodeled but still wearing the bones of the old red brick building downtown, smelled like a mix of printer toner, furniture polish, and peppermint gum. The kind tellers offered in the goodie dish shaped like a miniature vault. He met with the branch manager in a back office by the heavy file drawers. She was in her late 60s, just months from retirement. I knew Mary Ellen, came in with a smile every other Friday with her library check, she said softly. Never struck me as someone who needed a lot, but she always folded her bills in half when she deposited them. Neat, like origami. She handed over the archived paperwork, the signature card, matching IDs, bond slips. That's when Wallace saw it clear as glass. The co-signature line bore Keith's name, scrawled in the tight, clenched lettering of someone trying to copy neatness. Mary Ellen's was looser, confident, dated July 9, 1997. That was 4 months after Calvin died, right around the time Keith quietly took over the utilities and finances. Wallace's questions multiplied. Why would Keith co-sign an account that Mary Ellen never touched again? Why was the account under her maiden name, Weaver, at a time when everything about her public life still read Duvall? And above all, what was the money for? He returned to the police files, this time with an accountant from the county audit department. Together, they matched deposits from Mary Ellen's old employer, the library, leading up to September of 1999. Small, routine amounts. But in May, June, and again in August of that year, there were 3 large cash deposits, one for $700, another for $1,000, and a final one for nearly $1,400. Odd numbers, round envelopes. Retirement funds, Wallace asked. The auditor shook her head. No paper trail beyond deposit slips, not income, not standard banking. It looked like what people do when they're gathering escape money. Savings for a move, for a restart, maybe in Florida, maybe just out of Keith's house. And the account being opened under her maiden name, a small act of privacy, maybe even fear. Without formal charges or evidence at the time, Wallace had never explored Mary Ellen's finances. Back then, you needed warrants that didn't come easy in a missing adult case without signs of foul play. Now, with probate reopened and questions emerging, the access was broadening. Alongside the updated records was a slip Wallace hadn't seen before. One withdrawal attempt, October 5, 1999, declined. No ID shown, teller rejected. The man attempting to withdraw had signed the name Keith C. Duvall. I remember that day now, the retired branch manager said quietly when Wallace showed her the slip. He walked in early. He was sweating, smelled like gasoline and nerves, smiled too often. She wouldn't give him the money, said he needed Mary Ellen with him, or at least paperwork. He never came back. The details sat with Wallace like a stone. 3 days after Mary Ellen disappeared, Keith tried to withdraw nearly $40,000 from an account few knew existed, an account he'd conveniently co-signed over 2 years earlier, perhaps without her full awareness. And now, 24 years later, that old account was the thread. It tugged gently, but clearly, with a message buried in numbers. She hadn't vanished, she'd been stopped. It had been pinned on Wallace's board for nearly a quarter-century, a blurry lift of a fingerprint, grey and grainy, from the rear passenger door of Mary Ellen's Buick LeSabre. For years it meant nothing. No match locally, no match statewide. An edge smudge, partial ridge pattern, useless, really, by 1999 standards, especially in a county office with a single analog scanner and a faithful but fading copier. But things change. By 2023, Wallace had handed the cold case to Detective Michelle Granger, part of the department's newly resurrected cold case task force. Younger, sharper with tech, but respectful of procedure. She had the kind of mind that could sort chaos into a grid without losing her gut. And Granger, flipping through Wallace's old file one evening, paused at the evidence photo labeled Dusted Print MEBUICK, Rear Door, PSNL Vehicle. It wasn't fully readable, but with current technology, partials were no longer dead ends. AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system, had evolved dramatically since its full implementation in 1999. When combined now with advanced digital enhancement tools and regional database integrations, even partials could get hits. Granger submitted the old lift scan, now digitized, to the upgraded regional AFIS grid. 3 days later, she got a hit. Name, Keith Calvin Duvall. Match right thumb, partial ridge confirmation. Match confidence, 93%. The system had him on file from a DUI case in 2011, sealed, nothing serious, but enough to log him in AFIS. Granger couldn't quite believe it. She printed everything: comparison overlays, confidence index logs, metadata trails. Then she went down to the records room herself and pulled Wallace's original handwritten notes again. Interviewed K. Duvall, Oct. 4, stated he did not interact with vehicle, denied touching doors, driving or assisting in church drop-off, claims zero memory of vehicle position. A lie documented and now disproved, sitting there for nearly 25 years. That fingerprint wasn't just on the car, it was on the rear passenger door, odd, specifically because Mary Ellen always drove herself. No known passengers, she never carpooled, never let Keith borrow the car, according to every friend they ever interviewed. So why would his right thumb be pressed up against it? Not the front handle, not the driver's side. The back door. The kind of place a person might touch while loading or unloading something or someone. It broke the first rule of his statement that he'd kept his distance, no contact, no knowledge. Wallace met with Granger over lunch at Joni's Cafe, the place with the red vinyl booths and the jukebox still playing Tina Turner. She slid the file toward him slowly. "Looks like your ghost finally left a fingerprint," she said. He didn't smile. "Where exactly was the print again?" he asked. She showed him the spec photo. Buick, slightly rusted. Dust pattern showed clear impact zone at upper frame of the rear passenger handle. It looked like someone dragging their thumb along the door while applying pressure, not casually opening it. "You think he was loading something into the car?" she asked. Wallace considered, "Or out of it?" Granger nodded slowly, the silence between them filled with the distant fizz of a Coke being poured behind the counter. They both knew what that meant, one crucial certainty rising to the top: he had contact. It gave cause, it justified a re-interview. It was enough. But Granger was realistic. She outlined the forensic limitations. AFIS was accurate, but not infallible with partials. The confidence index was high, but a sharp defense attorney might argue degraded print quality. Chain of custody had remained intact only because Wallace had never not cared. "I'll say this," Granger said, "we pushed this thing forward based on the fact that he lied about even being near the car. Now we can place him at the scene. That gives us momentum, not the whole picture." Still, when Wallace returned to that Polaroid of the Buick in the driveway, slightly askew in the gravel, door swung open, keys left dangling in the ignition like a scene paused mid-frame. It didn't feel like momentum. It felt like guilt finally catching up. When they brought Keith in for interview, he was older, not elderly, but worn. Eyes paler, gut softer. Still working part-time at the grain company, alone. He wore a grey jacket with a loose cuff and called everyone sir or ma'am too often, like it was armor. When Granger calmly presented the fingerprint analysis, he didn't react. Didn't flinch, didn't reach for water or claim poor memory. Just looked down and said, "You can't prove when that got there." But they could prove he'd lied about it. That opened the door. Later that night, Wallace sat with Granger back at the station. Rain was misting the windows in thin lines. A police scanner hummed low in the background. "You know," Wallace said, sipping his now cold coffee, "sometimes it ain't the print that solves the case. It's the lie that tries to erase it." Granger nodded once, pulled up the next file. "Time to follow the lie," she said. It was a hunch, really. One of those instincts that sneaks up on you like an old pain on a cold night. After the fingerprint match and Keith's thin denial, Detective Michelle Granger started cross-referencing property logs. Not just Keith's house, but anything he'd registered under his name, even once, back when people still paid for things with handwritten checks. That's when she found it, buried in the fine print of an old debt consolidation filing from 2002. Beaver Creek Storage 47, rented under Duvall, KC. Lease start, October 6, 1999. Last payment posted, February 2001. It was a mid-sized unit, 10x10, outside of town, near the county line, shuttered over in a faded aluminium row that looked like a row of old bread boxes. Plastic tarps covered most of the rust. The rental had never been cleared or auctioned. The lot owner, dead since 7, company dissolved by 21, no records that it had ever been re-entered. It just sat, locked tight behind a rusting padlock on a forgotten signature. A warrant came quick. Granger and Wallace arrived early in the morning. The sky was still orange with fall, that color that makes you think of old flannel and wood smoke. The wind had that dry October sharpness, cutting through coats and rattling old leaves across gravel. The unit's door slid open with a reluctant screech. A single overhead bulb, yellowed, dead, hung loose on its wire. Inside, the air was stale with polyester and cardboard. Dust motes started dancing the second sunlight streamed in. What they found wasn't dramatic. Not at first glance. A plastic storage bin cracked along its side. 3 suitcases, neatly stacked. One of them, red, scuffed, hard shell, matching the Samsonite Mary Ellen's friend Barb remembered her keeping under the bed. Granger kneeled. It still had a luggage tag on it, the paper once white, now yellowed and curled. Name line, M.E. Weaver, not Duvall. Destination, Jacksonville, FL. Date Oct. 5, 1999. Inside the red suitcase were clothes that still held faint traces of lilac perfume, the kind Avon used to sell in cut glass bottles. A paperback devotional, flip-flops with the tags still tucked in, and a folder of printed directions, MapQuest, mid-download, half-faded. She'd been ready to go. Next to it sat another bin. Inside, a wool cardigan with faint, dry brown flecks near the collar, not pooled, not soaked, more like splattered. It could have been tea, could have been old sauce, could have been blood. Granger didn't say anything, she just bagged it. Wallace said quietly, "Get the lab to run the collar piece first. If it's hers, we move." Then she unzipped the last suitcase, the smallest one, tucked in beneath the others. Mary Ellen's lavender scarf was folded like tissue. Clean, soft, but threaded with something that didn't belong, faint, brittle hairs not matching her profile. The hairs were dark, dog possibly, or human. Granger stared down at that scarf for a long minute. It wasn't a weapon, wasn't torn, but its presence said something. This was meant to go with her, not be hidden. That scarf had been her favorite, She'd worn it the day she disappeared. Doris Hughes remembered it clearly after church, said she had that lavender thing on, tied like Grace Kelly in the old days. Why was it here? Every item told the same story. This was not a person who left voluntarily. This was someone interrupted. As they documented the find, Wallace noticed a faint imprint of a flattened cardboard box taped against the unit's side wall. One side read, "Holiday Front Closet." They unsealed it. Inside were fake garlands, a broken nativity figurine, and a single Christmas ornament with the initials C+M on it, drawn in silver marker. C for Calvin, M for Mary Ellen. Wallace exhaled slowly and murmured he couldn't even throw it away. By then, the evidence team had arrived. Luminol was testing fabric back at the lab. Photos were taken, the contents catalogued. Most chilling was what wasn't there. No DNA transfer from strangers, no fingerprints but Keith's, no other player in this story. And nothing in the entire unit proved that Mary Ellen ever came back out. Outside, Wallace leaned on the hood of the cruiser. "This isn't concealment," he said. "This is erasure, packed like she was real, then hidden like she was." Granger nodded, arms crossed. She was planned. Everything, the directions, the tags, the clothes, it was all lined up. Wallace looked out across the cornfields, bending in the wind. He didn't just stop her, he rewrote it like she never had a plan. And now, almost beautifully, like poetry clawing itself back, her suitcase had come home. The hardest part of reopening a cold case isn't the evidence. It's the people. 24 years changes faces, hardens voices. Grief settles differently in every room. Nobody cries the same in their 70s as they once did in their 40s. The sobs dry up. All that's left is a deep ache in the eyes. Mary Ellen's sister, June, still lived in Columbus, same one-story brick ranch off I-71. Still kept a flower box shaped like a swan under her front window. Same pink curtains that Mary Ellen helped her stitch one summer in 1986. When Wallace and Granger told her they'd found something, June covered her mouth and sat perfectly still. She didn't ask what. She just asked for a moment. Then she turned slowly and pointed them toward the old cedar chest by the window. "She left me one shoe," June said, "just one." Confused at first, Granger crouched next to the chest and opened it gently. Inside lay a single low-heeled dress shoe, powder blue, leather scuffed around the edges. A ticket stub from The Sound of Music folded inside. June's voice was quiet but certain. "She gave it to me after Calvin's funeral. Said if she ever needed to leave, I'd know. Called it her Cinderella plan. Said even if folks believed she left in a hurry, I'd know she had a second step planned." She stared at the window like it was a grave. She meant to live again, not vanish. The news about the storage unit hit gently but firmly, like confirmation of a death that had already been mourned too long without permission. She asked to see the suitcase. At the evidence office in Marion, June slowly ran her hand over the handle of the red Samsonite, then the scarf, then the devotional. Her fingers trembled but never jerked. "She packed these," she said. "This was her handwriting, all these labels. She used that slanted M since we were girls." They let her be in the room alone. When she emerged, she said just one thing aloud, less to them, more to the ghost in the air. "You were so close, Mare, so close." Granger turned to Wallace that evening as the sun dropped behind the fields. She had it set up, Florida, a name change account, directions printed out, clothing packed. She even said goodbye in her own way. Wallace nodded. "But she made one mistake," he added. "She trusted Keith to not stop her." They brought Keith in again, with the chain of evidence and evidence of chain. The suitcase, the bank account records, the scarf, the print on the Buick. When they told him about the storage unit, his face changed. Not fear. Not even panic. Resolve. He steepled his fingers and stared at the table. I didn't hit her, I didn't plan it, and I didn't mean for it to go like that. The words were cold and flat, not shouted, not choked. Just said. She told me she was leaving, said she had the bags in the car, said I couldn't stop her anyway, like she had the last word. Then, after a breath, she told me I didn't belong in that house anymore, that if she couldn't get the title, she'd at least take the memories. His fists tightened. She said Dad thought I was wasted potential, that I'd become small. Wallace didn't write anything yet, he didn't need to. She said I was clinging to ghosts, Keith whispered, and I just put my hands on her shoulders, just to make her stop talking, just to hold her still for a minute. A pause. She slipped, back hit the door frame, head hit that tile, the sharp part by the threshold, it cracked. His voice broke, or it tried to, but the tears wouldn't come. I didn't know what to do, I kept thinking she'd get up, but she didn't, and I panicked, put her in the back seat, covered her with a blanket, told myself I'd bury her where nobody'd undo her peace. And then what? Wallace asked. Keith stared at nothing. Then I packed up the rest like she never existed. A week later, cadaver dogs confirmed a body beneath a concrete slab at the Duvall shed. Ground-penetrating radar had already spotted the anomaly, roughly 6 feet long, 2.5 wide. Her scarf was buried bald in one hand. Dental records, long archived, made the ID official. When they told June, she didn't react for 10 seconds. Then she said. She never liked that shed, said it was cold and damp. She would have been furious someone put her there. Then came the moment Wallace would never forget. June turned away, looked out the window full of blowing autumn gold, and spoke more toward memory than the room. You don't move forward by erasing the past. You move forward by finally telling the whole truth. After the body was found, and the coroner's report confirmed the story Keith tried to shape as an accident, there was still one voice that hadn't fully spoken. June Weaver, Mary Ellen's younger sister. She'd always been the reserved one, less outspoken, more careful with what she let past her lips. But when the local news asked if she'd agree to sit down and speak about her sister now that the case had finally come to an end, she said yes. Not for the story, but for the closure. It was a quiet October morning, clouds low, marigolds blooming in planters out front. June wore a sky-blue cardigan and clasped her hands gently in her lap as the camera rolled inside her sunlit living room. The air smelled like lemon pie cooling on the windowsill, not made fresh that day, just warmed. A small act of welcome, the kind Mary Ellen used to do. She didn't start with anger or sadness, she started with memory. Mary Ellen always taught me to leave the kitchen cleaner than I found it, and to never speak badly about someone unless I'd said it to their face first. She wasn't perfect, but she tried hard to do right by people, even the ones who didn't want her there. The interviewer asked gently how June had carried this loss all those years. She nodded slowly. There's grief you can hold with both hands, then there's the kind that slips through like dust. You tell yourself a million stories about what might have happened, because not knowing is harder than knowing the worst. She looked into the camera at that moment, not accusatory, not fragile, but with the weight of someone who'd waited half a lifetime for this hour. He called me once, Keith, back in 2001, Christmas Eve, just said, "Merry Christmas, June," and hung up. I think maybe part of him was trying to reach out, or maybe say sorry without saying it. I don't know, but he knew, the whole time he knew. It was the first time she'd ever shared that. She took a breath. There's something very empty about being the only one left who remembers someone whole, not just the case, not just the photo, the whole person. And then she lifted the old photograph Wallace had given her back, Mary Ellen smiling with the apple pie, autumn sun behind her. She loved fall, said it was the only season that understood things have to let go. The camera captured the silence that followed. And in that space, there was more healing than drama. No sensational lines, no outbursts. Just grief, complete and whole, for a woman who'd never had the chance to write her next chapter. After the interview, June stepped out onto her small front porch. Plastic seat cushion, faded wind chime. The wind had picked up, and the bamboo chime swayed gently, clinking like far-off footsteps. She told the journalist one last thing off camera. She wasn't just my sister, she was the brave one. People think kindness is weakness. It's not. It's decided strength. Then she paused, turned toward her screen door, and murmured. He couldn't stand that she still had hope. That stuck with the producer more than anything else, she said. The program aired a week later on local television, an hour-long special called The Woman Who Waited to Be Found. No reenactments, just photos, quiet narration, and June's soft remembrance. Viewers described it as the saddest story they'd nearly forgotten. Mary Ellen's friends from church held a candlelight vigil 2 nights after the broadcast. They placed white roses against the steps of the now-abandoned Duvall home. A neighbor played Amazing Grace on an old clarinet, the notes shaky but sincere. The radio station played a gospel segment that Sunday in her name. For Mary Ellen Duvall, the host said gently, who did things right and disappeared quietly, but never truly left the hearts of those who loved her. Back in Columbus, June finally opened the last envelope left behind in Mary Ellen's safe deposit box. Inside was a recipe card, lemon pie, her handwriting. At the bottom, it read, "For when you need something sweet after life goes bitter." She made that pie the next day. And when the crust was just golden enough, she sat on that porch with her tea and her memory and said, aloud to no one but the birds resting on the line, "I heard you, Mayor, I always heard you." Keith Duvall was sentenced on a soft October afternoon. The courtroom in Marion wasn't filled. Murder cases this cold rarely are, but the quiet buzz of something long unfinished finally being faced was everywhere. The charge, second-degree murder. 25 years had softened the outlines of the man, but not the damage. He sat in a tan jacket, older now, heavy in the face, eyes rimmed with fatigue more than remorse. The prosecution's story was clean. No drama, just proof layered atop omission, fingerprint on the Buick, recovered items from the storage unit, the untruths piled high, each a piece of a mechanism designed to quietly erase a life. His public defender argued what Keith himself had claimed, that it was not premeditated, that Mary Ellen had fallen during a heated disagreement, that his actions after the fact were desperate, not diabolical. But the jury didn't buy it. Neither did the judge. A delayed burial is still a burial. The sentence came down, 28 years to life, eligible for parole after 20. At the end, the judge asked Keith if he had anything to say. He did not. He just looked down at his shoes, now shined to court standard but worn nonetheless. The Duvall name no longer meant much in Marion. Calvin was a memory in a mechanic's shop once torn down, and Keith, quiet Keith, would be remembered not as a son misled, but a man who could not stand the sound of another person's hope outliving his own failures. The house on Harvest Road was sold before year's end. June helped box up Mary Ellen's remaining things, books, doilies, recipe cards still stuck in the old tin, and one small ceramic angel that had lost its hand. The new owners painted it green, took down the wind chimes, paved over the garden. But the shed, it was torn out to its foundation. Nothing grew there since. The dirt never quite settled right. People asked June if she felt closure. She gave the same answer every time. The truth doesn't heal. It just frees you up to start grieving properly. In the last pages of the file, Wallace Crawley tucked a note to himself. One page folded neatly. In it, he wrote, he could have asked her to leave peacefully. He could have started over, but pride tells men like Keith that asking for help is weakness. Mary Ellen survived grief. He only survived himself. That line stayed with the new recruits in the department long after Wallace retired. Michelle Granger kept the case summary in her drawer. Whenever someone talked about quick judgments, she'd glance at it. Because nothing about the case had been quick, except the moment it turned deadly. Months later, Granger visited June one final time. No badges, no forms, just a stop on a porch creaking under early winter. They shared coffee, talked about nothing. Granger asked her what she thought Mary Ellen would have said if she knew this. Many people came to remember her. June smiled, almost mischievously. She would have said, "It's about time folks realized I mattered," but then she'd have baked something and said, "Now sit, enough fuss." She didn't like being the center of anything, even when she deserved to be. Before she left, Granger asked one final thing. "What do you think made Keith snap, really snap?" June looked out across her quiet lawn, where the leaves had fallen but not yet turned entirely to rot. The sky was silver, pressed down low. She didn't hesitate. "I think he couldn't live with the idea that someone else was brave enough to leave the story before he finished writing it for her." Then she added, more quietly, "And in doing that, he ended the only version of her life left that hadn't already given up on him." Later that winter, there was snow in Marion. Not the sticky snow of storms, but the dusting kind, fine and quiet. At the cemetery, where Mary Ellen Duvall was finally given a service, only a simple stone was placed. It read, Mary Ellen Weaver, Duvall, 1944–1999. She had plans. No sermon, just June reading a devotional, the last page of the notebook she and her sister used to pass between them like secret letters growing up. The final quote came from Romans, but June added her own line. She wanted peace, she trusted wrongly once, but she never stopped hoping, and that speaks more of her than the act that ended her life. In the end, there was no twist of villainy, no masked monster. Just a man. And a bitter choice, born years before the moment itself. A moment of pride instead of mercy. And a woman who tried, gently, quietly, patiently, to get free. She almost did. Almost.